I'm pleased to welcome back a frequent guest, a gentleman who has been with us on numerous occasions, Dr. Thomas Rudd. Doctor, thank you for joining me. How are you today, sir?
Well, I'm very good, especially since you were able to walk me through putting me on Skype, and that you should get a gold medal to have me do anything to do with a computer successfully. So thank you very much, Jason.
Well, we're pleased to see you on live video. And of course, our first meeting, Doctor, was just about 6 months ago, where you told us about the really bizarre and troubling case of Melissa Calusinski and what's been called the daycare center murders there in Lake County, where you, of course, formerly were the chief medical examiner and the coroner, correct?
Yes, basically my title was coroner, and by trade I am a physician pathologist also.
And you've been really helpful, Doctor, in a number of broadcasts helping the members of the Crowdsource community understand the role of the coroner in multiple different cases, even outside, acting almost as a professional witness for us, commenting, of course, on the autopsies from the Las Vegas shooting of October 1st. But I became very interested in this story when a viewer, a member of the Crowdsource community, brought it to our attention. And of course, you've been pivotal in the case. It first came to you because you were the coroner, correct? Or how did it first come to your attention?
Let's back up a little
Yes.
bit, a preview. In 2011, the coroner at the time had to resign, and I was asked to take over. And I thought I had the qualifications. Long story short, the powers to be in Lake County, despite the fact that the Democratic Party could select this individual, the powers to be in Lake County, meaning corrupt state's attorneys and law enforcement, got a Democrat who just happened to be an ex-policeman and ex-chief of police of Waukegan, Illinois. And I lost out to him. And then when I read his background, I realized that this guy was a terrible man. He actually, while holding office, was indicted in a civil suit for beating a man into a confession of murder that
Wow.
he didn't commit. Yes, and this was our coroner. And it was even more dastardly when I read it. He basically took a man into the basement with two other policemen, beat his head against the wall. He wouldn't confess. They stuck a gun in his mouth, said they would blow his brains out and make it look like a suicide, and then pin it on his wife.
Wow. What was this guy's name?
Yancey, Artis, Artis, Yancey, Yancey. I found this horrible, and I couldn't believe that the Democratic leaders of Lake County would appoint this guy, but they did, so I ran against him. Lo and behold, there was a case that he stupidly tried to cover up a police murder. We caught him at it, and the citizens of Lake County elected me when I should have lost. Okay, and I see you're bringing stuff up. Yes, Chief of Police as Lake County coroner. You're very good, Jason. That's a tough
This was
one.
hard to find, Doctor. They seem to be maybe working to not publicize this quite so much.
You know, the story about him being indicted in a civil case, which, by the way, was Kathleen Zellner, the same one on Melissa's case. Now, the only person who published it was an author. Well, I'm forgetting her last name, but first name is Elizabeth something. She's the only one that published the fact that Mr. Yancey was involved in this illegal conviction. And when I debated him, he got the powers to be to settle the case real quickly and seal it. Anyway, as a result, I got in. Now, prior to getting in, the lawyer for Melissa Calusinski met with me, asked me to review the case, which I did, and I was shocked with the findings. They were so opposite of what they claimed it was. They claimed it was an acute injury that affected the child, and when I reviewed it, it was a chronic injury. And I even questioned my own ability as to what I was seeing. So luckily at the time, we were employing the ex-medical examiner of Cook County, Dr. Nancy Jones, who was my chief pathologist, she was run out of Cook County with a. They set her up for too many bodies in the in the morgue because she was too honest of a pathologist. They wanted her out,
Wow.
so they set. And she came to work for me. She reviewed the case, agreed that this was a horrible mistake on this child, that it was not an acute injury, it was a chronic injury.
Now, let me pause you just for a second, doctor, because I have reviewed some of this in preparation for our conversation today, and I believe what you're referring to is that Melissa Calusinski has been accused of, and is in jail for, basically dropping this baby on the floor or hitting his head in some way that caused his death. And what you've discovered from detailed x-rays is that your child had a chronic injury of blood on the brain, very likely caused by what his own mother testified was his propensity to bang his head during temper tantrums that caused a buildup of essentially scab tissue and blood on the brain.
Right. But we also found out, Jason, that there's a documented injury 6 weeks before his death at the daycare center when Melissa had not been hired yet. So an injury 6 weeks prior. Now, a very suspicious injury. He was put to bed for a nap with other children, and lo and behold, wakes up with a tennis ball bump on the back of his head.
Wow.
How does a child get put to bed with a nap with others, wakes up screaming with a bump on his head? Nobody worked that up. That's very suspicious. That's very suspicious that somebody injured this child. Maybe he got up and was crying, he wouldn't be quiet, I don't know. But he was injured 6 weeks prior to his death, in which Melissa had not been hired yet, and we now know that that was the injury that caused the subdural hematoma, which started healing over the next 6 weeks. But because, as you see here, Benjamin Kingen was a headbanger, and a lot of kids are headbangers, meaning that they're learning how to walk, they're learning how to be their own individual, and they don't like to be held, and they bump their heads, and it can be traumatic. But most of the time, kids bump their heads, nothing happens. But if you got blood on the brain, it's like when you cut yourself on your hand in the yard, but you continue gardening the next few days. What happens is the scab comes off, it rebleeds, and fluid comes out. It heals, rebleeds, except now you're in a confined space of the skull, and that rebleeding and that fluid that's coming out has no place to go.
And he was an infant, obviously, 16 months old. Could the child even speak?
Very little, maybe one or two words. But after we found out this mistake, we couldn't believe what had happened. So I wrote a letter to the state's attorney saying that there's a tremendous error here. Justice wasn't done. Here's the new autopsy report that we put together by Dr. Jones. I'm submitting it. I agree. I'm entering it into the chart. I submitted to the state's attorney, requested that we meet, and he never got hold of me. Okay.
Wow. And of course, Dr. Jones is a very experienced pathologist, contrasting the way the medical examiner or the coroner is selected in Clark County, in Cook and Lake counties. The coroner is a medical doctor, a pathologist. So you had two medical doctors looking at this.
That's correct. And she's probably she since has passed, but she was one of the top 10 forensic pathologists probably in the nation.
Wow.
In terms of not being academic, but just practicing. So when this new report came out, a reporter came to me and talked to me, and he said that the state's attorney, Mr. Nierheim, never received the report. And of course, we knew that was false because I had my chief deputy take it over there. So I said, well, that's interesting. I gave the reporter a piece of paper, the letter I sent Mr. Nierheim, and he went over there and he said, oh, yes, I did receive it. Okay, I forgot. But what he really was saying when he told the reporter, he said, well, I didn't receive the report, nor did I read it. Being a lawyer, he parsed it. When it was delivered, his second in command received it, His second in command read it to him. So therefore, when the state's attorney says, I didn't receive it, nor did I read it. You see where I'm going with that? He's parsing words. His second in command received it and read it to him. So therefore, he never got it.
Ah, very clever.
Yeah, exactly. And so now you know what you're dealing with. So this is what I did. So I said, okay, I believe that this case was missed by Dr. Choi. He was the pathologist that did the case the first time. So why don't I meet with Dr. Choi in a collegial, friendly, non-threatening manner and discuss the case with him, which I did. And I did it to make sure that I could document it. I did it the old-fashioned way. I used snail mail. I sent him. He sent me a letter back, and we met. It took about 2-3 weeks. He came in for 2.5 hours. We discussed the case. He was a little defensive, but I wasn't challenging him. He knew and worked with Dr. Jones, so he respected her findings. So after 2.5 hours, I gave him some literature. I asked him to read it. About 2 or 3 weeks later, he writes me a letter that was stunning. First of all, he agrees that he made a mistake. Secondly, and this was most shocking, he had already told the prosecuting attorney that he had second thoughts before going to trial, stating to her, I think I made a mistake, it's a chronic injury.
Wow.
Now that's stunning for the following reason. The defense attorney could not make that meeting. In other words, the attorney for Melissa couldn't make it, sent a paralegal. The paralegal did not understand what Dr. Choi was saying. So she never communicated that he had changed his mind.
Wow. How could she not understand it?
Well, she didn't understand the medicine. Okay, so they're talking back and forth. Plus, the prosecutorial attorney was making light of it as if it wasn't important. That person should have been disciplined for ethics violation because you just now changed the whole case. You didn't tell the defense. You assumed the paralegal would do it, and they went ahead with the trial. Should have never gone ahead.
Wow.
It should never have gone ahead. And this woman should be prosecuted, except in Lake County, they made her a judge.
Whoa.
So now she's a judge for successful prosecution. So now we have a letter from Dr. Choi while I'm in office stating, not only do I agree with Dr. Rudd, I made a mistake, but I already told you that in 2011.
That's amazing.
Now, of course, think it would be enough to toss the case.
You would. And doctor, you've mentioned to us in previous conversations that you actually had found a superior quality X-ray, that there was an overexposure problem with the X-ray that was being used for the initial examination. And I've got them here side by side. I think even non-medical individuals can tell that the image on the left has virtually no detail. And in the image on the right, correct me if I'm wrong, doctor, but it seems to me that this darkened area here of the skull indicates something? No,
it's actually normal. The whole image is now normal. Okay, because what a skeletal survey, this is a skeletal survey, will show is strictly bone. It will not show soft tissue, so you won't see the subdural. But here's the key. Here's the key. Look at that image, the good image on my right. That would be this one here. Look how the head is shaped like a light bulb.
Yes.
That is not normal. Take a look at your own head in the mirror. Does your head look like a light bulb? No. What is happening is that skull is expanding from fluid, and it's expanding, and as the fluid builds up, eventually the skull cannot expand anymore, and the brain is shoved down, and the first part of the brain that controls breathing goes through this narrow hole of the skeleton and it shuts down the child's breathing. So
and you've also previously discussed how Benjamin actually had a twin. I didn't know that until very recently. And there was something about the skull of the twin being in the 50th percentile and Benjamin's being in the 90s something. What was that all about?
You're very good, Jason. You got your facts. What makes this even more sad in terms of not catching this
Mm.
is that he had a twin sister, and she remained in the 50th percentile of skull growth in these 6 weeks, while he went from 50 to 92 percentile. So in 6 weeks, this child's skull increased from 50 to 92, while the twin remained at 50. And the pediatricians never thought or suspected anything. Had they known, all they'd have to have done was operated and released the pressure, and the child would have been saved. But they ignored the changes. They kept saying, "Well, it's within normal limits." Now, I must admit that that a child that can't talk has very limited resources in terms of saying what's wrong with their head.
Right.
Generally, when children can't talk and they have bleeding in their brain, they become very lethargic. In other words, they'll wake up after a nap and immediately you turn around, they fall asleep again. Okay, because the pressure in the brain. They also have vomiting, and they have unusual vomiting, what they call projectile vomiting, which is vomiting as if it was shot out of a gun. Sometimes you can go 6 or 7 feet in a 16-month-old. That is a sign of head injury. And lethargy is also a sign of something's wrong with the brain. Whenever he exhibited those changes, he wasn't around a pediatrician. So when mom took him to the doctor the next day, because the behavior was not that of an emergency room visit, he'd be normal. Okay? So this was a tragedy of error over 6 weeks. Now, in regards to these films, Jason,
Yes.
the poorly developed image is actually not an overexposure. We first thought it was an overexposure. The poor image was given to the defense attorney. His expert, which was a pathologist, not a radiologist, said, "These are no good. Can you give us better ones?" The prosecutorial attorney went back and tried to get better images, came back and said, "Sorry, that's the best we can do." The deputy coroner in charge of the x-ray material in the coroner's office won't be back for vacation until X date. Now, Mr. Yancey, by the way, was in office at this time. So this man came back from vacation. They went back and said, "Can you get us better images?" Lo and behold, they couldn't. Now, what you see is not an overdevelopment. What you see is a compressed image that you have to bring out and add the other 98% of the material that's in there. There is a way of doing it, but they didn't tell the defense attorney how to do it because they themselves didn't know how to do it.
Wow.
So they gave them. They're claiming right now in court, well, you had the information, you just had to know how to do it. Well, that's like turning over evidence to the defense and saying, well, it's locked up, you have to find a key to get in. That's ridiculous. In other words, no instructions were given on how to make the image on the left look like an image on the right.
Right.
Okay. But more importantly, 2 prosecutorial attorneys, when they tried to get it themselves, said they couldn't be done. So they were as dumb as anybody. Yes, it was there, but you didn't know how to bring it up, nor did you give instructions to the defense to bring it up. It's what we call withholding exculpatory evidence, a violation of something called Brady rule, where the prosecution, if they know they have good images, must produce them. And they didn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
Shocking, doctor. It's amazing. And, aside from the human tragedy, this is a very interesting case to me because we're seeing so much prosecutorial misconduct today in the United States, whether it's the Bundy trial, this trial, Melissa Calusinski, your own trial. And when we start to examine the details, something that very often the major media news sources are too busy doing, or perhaps it's a conflict of interest for them to do, when we start to dig into the details in the way that you're sharing right now, the connections are unbelievable. The corruption and the suppression of this information. I know it's not the type of thing that doctors generally like to do for me to ask you to speculate, but do you have any idea as to why all of these circumstances have sort of conspired to make this case go the way it has? And is there a connection between your own case, the Melissa Calusinski case and your removal and persecution as the Lake County coroner?
Well, let's talk about the first part of that question. Why did this occur?
Yes.
Prosecutors don't care who they convict. Now, they're not. A lot of them will scream at us on this. All they care about is finding somebody they can pin the bad thing that was done, in this case, a murder. So they assumed that the last person interacting with Benjamin Kingen had to be the person that caused the death. So they went after this individual and browbeat her and forced her to confess. It was a 9 or 10 hour session. She waived her Brady rights, and she has an IQ of about 70. And they convinced her through browbeating and threatening behavior that she did it. And that's horrific. It's actually horrific. How can you take an individual who there is no evidence that she did it and just force her to say she did it just to get a conviction? That's terrible. There is an article prior to my running for office that also influenced me. I think his name is Andrew Martin. It's the November issue, November 2011 issue of the New York Times Magazine. It's called "The Prosecution's Case Against DNA." Okay, it's the prosecution's case against DNA, November 2011, New York Times, Andrew Martin. Martin, who, interestingly enough, Jason, took this case only because they couldn't find another writer to do it. Andrew Martin is a brilliant business writer. He writes a business. And in fact, it was the last article he wrote before joining the Wall Street Journal. So he did an incredible investigative report. Anybody out there that's listening to us, read this. It's all about Lake County. It's all about how they don't care who they pin the murder on, as long as they pin somebody, even when DNA shows that they couldn't have done it.
Wow. Well, I presume in the perspective of a prosecutor, a successful prosecution is putting someone in jail, finding them guilty, whereas a failure is a verdict of not guilty. So I can understand perhaps they might object to the way of phrasing it, not so much that they don't care who they prosecute, but their focus is different. They're looking for a successful conviction.
Correct. All they care about is a conviction, a quick one, and as reasonably costing as possible.
Right.
Because
and then they have a record that says X number of successful prosecutions.
Right. And therefore they get promoted, i.e. Kristen Bishop, an individual who tried Melissa, knew that the evidence was wrong, and she went ahead and prosecuted Melissa, knowing it was a chronic injury, and her reward is what? It is a nice, cushy job as a judge. And what happened a few months ago when a very smart attorney decided to run against her because of what she did, and I helped this attorney get the signatures. They challenged this lawyer and threw him off the ballot on technicality so that she now is running unopposed.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? They wanted to protect this woman for something she did 7-8 years ago because she did what they wanted, and therefore let's get this attorney, because if this gets out what she did, she'll lose. And they threw this man off the ballot on a technicality.
Doctor, why do they want so badly to prosecute Melissa for this crime?
Because they don't really want to spend the time and effort to find the real person that caused the injury. Remember, it was documented that this individual, that Benjamin injured himself 6 weeks prior, a wound was inflicted on Benjamin 6 weeks prior to his death. Somebody else caused this problem, and they would have to go back and investigate it. It would take time and money because they'd have to find out who the employees were there and interview them. They don't want to do that. Let me tell you something. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this case, Jason, because this case, the is 7, 8 years old.
Right.
Okay, it's going to be hard to go back. But what we found out, Jason, that when you read the article of Andrew Martin, lo and behold, every time these people are released because DNA shows that they couldn't have done it, within days they indict somebody else who they know really did it. Now, is that shocking or what? They know who did it, and they fight it in courts. As soon as that person's released, they arrest the right man.
It makes no sense. I mean, obviously they must know something beforehand.
They knew who it was when the person in jail was fighting it on the DNA, saying I couldn't have done it. They were looking around to see who could have possibly did it, and they knew who it was. But they waited until the judges decided that the DNA freedom, and then 2 days, 3 days later, a week later, they indict the person who did it and convict them.
Wow.
I mean, it's disgusting. It's disgusting. They should go before the judge and say, you know what? We're looking around. We found the guy. He confessed. You know, there. Now you've got a picture of the biggest dirtbag in Lake County, Mike Mermel. Okay, he's the prosecutor who said disgusting things about how you get DNA on yourself in motels with whores. Okay, you know, he said anybody can smear themselves with somebody else's DNA from a remote control from a motel after an illicit meeting with somebody. I mean, the guy was forced to resign, thank God.
Huh. Sounds quite ridiculous. How much DNA is on a remote control at a motel?
Yeah, they're saying, well, you wipe yourself, you know, after going to the bathroom, you can get some DNA off of the remote. Okay, you know what he's referring to. Okay. The guy's a lowlife, okay, and I'm glad he's out of his job. But I tell people, if you come to Lake County and you're stopped for other than a traffic infraction, you ask 2 questions. 1, am I under arrest? 2, can I go? If either question is answered yes, shut up and get a lawyer. Don't talk to any law enforcement in Lake County whatsoever. They're not to be trusted.
Wow, that's a scary thing.
So the second part of your question was,
yes,
did they come after me for it? Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They were desperate to get me thrown off the ballot because they knew that I was a hands-down winner, that upon re-election there would be a landslide in my favor because of other cases, the Fox Lake case. And so they caught me in an error that I made where I signed a few sheets of circulated petitions that I did not circulate. And without going into great detail, I thought I could do it. Okay, I was under the impression I could do it. After all, I was the candidate, so I thought it was going to be done. Secondly, there are many states within the United States where that is legal. So election code is not criminal code. So every state has different election codes. For instance, in Florida, yes, somebody can go out there, gather the signatures, and you put your John Hancock on it. Well, in Illinois, you can't do it. So when they approached me, when my petitions were objected to, I hired the top election attorney in the state of Illinois. Mm-hmm. He reviewed it with me, and he said, you made an error. And I said, well, can I be prosecuted for it? He said, highly unlikely. And that was enough for me. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. If you're telling me I can be prosecuted, it's a wrong. So the correct thing to do is withdraw. I withdrew my name. Now, whenever you make a mistake in the eyes of the law, you should try to correct it. So after withdrawing as the Democrat, I said, I'll run as an independent, okay, to correct my mistake. Now, here's the key to that. When you run as an elected official, you need 0.05% of the prior vote. When you run as a independent, you need a hell of a lot more. I think you need 0.5%. So in other words, I only needed 800 signatures to get on as a Democrat. I needed 10,000 signatures to get on as an independent. But you know what I got? 14,650 signatures.
Very good.
90 days, not one of which, not one signature was challenged as opposed to when I was a Democrat. And they threw me off the ballot on a technicality that said Well, Dr. Rudd, despite you withdrew as the Democratic candidate for coroner, guess what? You're still a Democrat for a year. So I asked the judge, is this like the song of the Hotel California? You can check in, but you can't check out. But that makes no sense.
You can never leave, right?
You believe I'm a Democrat for a whole year? Now, here's what even more amazing. This is even more amazing because I thought, God, luck is on my side. Prior to my circuit court hearing on this, a judge in Effingham County, Illinois, ruled that part of the election code unconstitutional and put the person on the ballot. We went to our judge and they said, well, sorry, that has borders. Circuit courts has a border. It's only a good in that circuit court, not in this one. You're off the ballot.
It's amazing.
So wait a minute. We go to the appellate court. Just before our appellate court hearing, a United States federal judge in Bloomington, Illinois, rules that part of the law unconstitutional and puts that candidate on the ballot. What happens with the appellate court? They're so scared of ruling against me because then I could go to the Supreme Court of Illinois and win. They waited until 5 minutes to 5 on the last day before printing the ballots and ruled against me.
Wow.
So that when my attorney gets an email saying, you lost, the very next day the ballots are printed, and it took 2 weeks for us to get to the Illinois State Supreme Court, and they were too scared to take the case because if they ruled in my favor, there would be catastrophic changes. They'd have to crash print the new ballots. So they decided not to hear the case. Not that I wouldn't win, but they didn't want to cause trouble, and so therefore I was off.
It's amazing, Doctor. There's so many mechanisms that clever people who understand the system can use. Even if you're in the right, they can really put you behind the 8 ball. I mean, we're talking to a lot of people who are experiencing these punitive lawsuits, and in your case, punitive, faulty criminal and election charges and all kinds of crazy things that I guess they could technically say aren't exactly corrupt, but sounds pretty corrupt to me.
Let me give you another example. We had in Cook County, not in Lake County, there was a race for assessor. One of the candidates did exactly what I did, signed some petitions that she shouldn't have, and the election board threw her off. Well, guess what? A circuit court put her back on. Okay, they put her back on, and then the appellate court threw her off, and then she went to a higher court, and she got on again. So she actually got on the ballot for doing what I did, and there's no prosecution of her.
Wow.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Our laws are used for getting people depending on who's in power. Okay.
And that's another common theme that we've been seeing, obviously. If you have money, if you have political power, if you know how to game the system, you can get away with it. And then the average person, even if they're trying to be honest, just basically continually gets screwed. This poor woman, Melissa Calusinski, she was 22, so her IQ is so low that she's been even categorized as mentally disabled to a certain extent. And just to real quickly wrap up on the Calusinski matter, what is it that occurred that caused this case to now go to an appeals court?
Well, unfortunately, the way the judicial process works, it's very long and fatiguing. Melissa appealed immediately, but here's the problem. You go to the original judge, then the circuit court judge, original judge is the circuit court, and then you go to the appellate court, and then you go to the Supreme Court, but they can only hear the first round of appeals with the original evidence, despite the fact that when I got into office in 2012 or December 2012, by May of 2013, just being 6 months in the office, we had written up the new report and said a tragic mistake was made. She couldn't have possibly killed this guy. They couldn't use the new evidence until they went through the process of circuit court, appellate court, Supreme Court. And this is where prosecution plays games. Okay? They keep you in jail. So right. even if they know you're innocent, Okay, they'll say, well, by the time they get through the appeal process, she'll spend half the time in jail. That'll be enough for us to say justice was done. Then we'll let her go. So in other words, it took 18 months to have the circuit court hearing. It took another 18 months to have the appellate court hearing. Then we had another 18 months where we had the Supreme Court hearing, and they all rejected her. Now they say you can present the new evidence.
But this is a woman who's 30 or 31 years of age and has spent 9 years in jail. That's basically the majority of her adult life. She'll never be the same.
That's correct. And this is another thing we have to think about is these people that are in the in the state's attorney's office and in the judicial system and law enforcement. They act as if they've been knighted by somebody or given the job by God. They are actually public citizens that have been elected to a public office. And what is happening is they're wasting our money. Melissa will let's back up. Anybody now who's convicted of something like murder and found innocent later, they generally will end up getting $1 million a year. So in other words, in a civil lawsuit, they'll get $1 million a year. So Melissa will get $9 or $10 million. But if somebody came to you, Jason, and said,
"Not worth it.
Yeah, I'll put you in jail and come back in 9 years, and then I'll hand over $9 million," nobody would take it. Juan Rivera, if someone came to him and said, "Look, spend 21 years in jail like you did, you'll have $21 million," nobody would do it. Nobody would do it. And here's the one more thing I have to get across. These civil suits that turn over this money to these people are huge amounts of money that are paid by the citizens. But here is where we have fault with civil matters. When they do settle cases for huge sums, the real reason isn't because we're so sorry for that woman, she suffered or he suffered, and we must pay him something. No, they're really doing it because the dirty cops, the dirty lawyers, the dirty judges never get disciplined. Let me give you one quick example. Juan Rivera, 21 years in jail. They're going to civil court. The evidence is presented by the plaintiff, the lawyer for Mr. Rivera. Guess what caused the case to be settled? The blood of the decedent that is allegedly on Mr. Rivera's shoes. They found out in court prior hearing that the shoes had not been invented yet by Nike.
Wow.
In other words, they tainted shoes of Mr. Rivera, but they hadn't been invented yet. As soon as the state's attorney heard, oh my God, this guy set him up, I'll have to prosecute this law enforcement officer. Mr. Nierheim came in and gave the plaintiff a blank check, $21 million, but we have to seal everything. None of this comes out, and we're not going after the bad cops. So when you hear a civil suit that's settled for a lot of money, it's also covering up the bad cops, and they will not be disciplined.
That's absolutely crazy, Doctor.
It's true.
There's a very good question coming from the comments from our viewers on YouTube here. Do you know if it's a privately owned prison? Karen O is asking if Melissa is in a privately owned prison.
No, it is not privately owned. It's a state prison, and it's also have state employees. So there is no firm that, we now have private firms running state state prisons. But no, it's not a private firm running it. She's in a regular prison. Luckily, I think because of the press she's gotten, she's been left alone, because if you kill a baby, you go to jail, you might get killed yourself. But because of the publicity around there, I think the prison population realized she's been set up and have left her alone.
Wow. Now, of course, Doctor, there's been a recent development in your case as well. Would you like to speak about that?
Yes. After being indicted, I was looking, boy, this is something else.
And this was for the election stuff, right? The indictment?
Right. I had lost the election. I ran as a write-in. I got 8,600 signatures. Unfortunately, I was about 120,000 less than necessary. But the 8,600 signatures I got are the most anybody has ever gotten in the history of Lake County as a write-in. I think the top number of signatures were 1,000.
Wow.
Anyway, there were some citizens that bent over backwards to try to get me in. So I left office on 12/1/16, and on 2/15/17, I received an indictment for signing 5 sheets of paper I shouldn't have signed. Now, I was shocked, and I thought, well, this is ridiculous. This has got to be payback for what I've done. So I figured this shouldn't be a problem. It'll be just pushed down to misdemeanor, and I'll get a punishment and walk away. Well, I started Googling about what happens to people, and lo and behold, a physician ran for United States Senate in 2015 from the great state of South Dakota. She did the exact same thing I did, except she signed 1 extra sheet, 6 sheets. She was indicted not only for signing them, but turning them in. So she had 6 times 2, 12 counts of felony. She fought it thinking she would win because there was no criminal intent is what she was doing. In fact, she's a good-hearted physician that goes to places that need free medical care for a month. She was in the Philippines or in Africa. She signed the sheets when she came back. They indicted her on 12 counts. She lost to a jury trial and was given 24 years in jail.
And
now,
was that Annette Bosworth?
Yes. Yes. Dr. Bosworth. And of course, she didn't serve the time, thank God, because she's never done anything wrong. But guess what? She has lost her license.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Right. And the only reason they went after her, in my case, it's because of the 4 or 5 cases that I confronted the law enforcement for doing the wrong thing. She actually fought the medical board because the people she takes care of are American Indians who are very poor. So she tried to save the state some money by using non-brand name medications, and she fought the medical board saying, I'm not going to order the expensive ones. And so she had appeared before the medical board, and lo and behold, they almost disciplined her, but she won. And of course, she was labeled a troublemaker, so time to pay her back.
Wow. You know, Doctor, I contrast this to some of the cases that I'm examining with people like Charles Ortel, where we hear about the Clintons and the Clinton Health Access Initiative and the Clinton HIV/AIDS initiative, and how they use generic drugs bought from a questionable Indian pharmaceutical company that had made multi-million-dollar donations to their foundation and then sent them to Africa, where these drugs hadn't been tested and might even be injuring people. Sounds like this is a minor infraction compared to that, yet no one has been indicted or prosecuted in the case of the Clintons.
Correct. That is very good. Annette Bosworth used generic branded medicines from the United States. Okay, that's what she was using. She was not going to India. So now that you bring that up, let me tell you, your public, that you can get very good brand name medication from Canada. Now, let me tell you how this works, which shows you the greed of pharmacies. There are countries in the world that will go to American pharmacies and say, look, you're going to sell us your medication or we'll make our own. And they have laws that allow it, and our pharmacy can't go after them in the legal system.
The pharmaceutical company itself, you mean?
That's correct. So my mother herself had Alzheimer's, and her pills were like $10 times 2 pills, $20 a day. The governor at the time of Illinois contracted with a very reputable Canadian pharmacy firm that could get brand name medication. But this shows you how it works. You call up Canada. Canada asks for whatever company makes this drug. They call up India. India calls up the same company that's in the United States, gets it sent to India, India back to Canada, Canada to the patient at 90% off.
Wow.
So who's the greedy one here? To me, it's the pharmaceuticals. They're more than willing to sell it to India. They're still making a profit at 90 off, but they don't want to sell it to local Americans because we're paying for the research. Okay, so you can get branded medication, and that's how it works. There are good Canadian pharmacies up there. And if anyone wants to know, I'm not going to say it over the internet. Anyone wants to contact me, I'll give you some reputable Canadian pharmacies who will get you brand name medication. The same package you buy in the pharmacy at $100 a tablet, they send to India, send to Canada, and you pay them $10.
And Bernie Sanders spoke about this, of course, Doctor. It seems like this is a huge problem. So many people in the United States, I mean, we have all this advanced medical technology that can prolong people's lives, but yet pharmaceutical companies are earning so many billions per year, and then insurance companies get involved to pay them. And when we start to look behind the curtain, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see the same kind of group of billionaires being investors in both of these industries and then using their billions to fund the campaigns of politicians who enable all of this. So everyone's worried about healthcare costs. It seems like there's a sensible way to address it, but it's not being exercised.
No, even though I'm a Democrat in name, okay, I can't stand the Clintons because they're just money grubbers. And you're right, they have the pharmaceutical industry in their back pocket, and they pay the Clintons, and we don't have a decent pharmacy system. The Part D that we have, I'm on it myself, you have to spend thousands of dollars before this donut hole or whatever hole they call, but that you dump all your money before they kick in to pay for your pharmacy bills. Nobody wants private companies to go bankrupt at giving drugs away, but at the same time, they shouldn't make sinfully outrageous amounts of money. Didn't they just send some guy to jail, some internet guy who bought a drug company?
Martin Shkreli, yes.
Correct. I mean, that was sinful what he did. Okay. I don't know the real answer, to be honest with you. They're private companies. They could probably charge what they want. But if people are dying because they can't afford it, then what? I think the problem is this. As we well know, capitalism works. You make a product, you sell it on demand. But at the same time, when groups of people get together to purchase something, they can drive the price down. Why? Because the pharmacy companies say, gee, we're going to make 40 times what we normally sell. Obviously, we can discount. We all know that when you go to Costco or Walmart, they sell by giant volumes, so you get each item less. Same thing with pharmacy. But what happened? The government was not allowed to negotiate Medicare, Medicaid with the pharmaceutical companies because certain politicians like the Clintons were paid off.
Well, I think there's other things happening as well, and I am also a staunch supporter of capitalism. What I object to is crony capitalism, rigged capitalism, and all of that type of thing. I think there's a number of issues in the pharmaceutical industry, and I mean, we've heard about things like the 1984 Vaccine Injury Act, where under Ronald Reagan's presidency, they made it illegal for anyone to sue a pharmaceutical company for any injuries their child might sustain from vaccines. And it also categorized vaccines as biological rather than pharmaceutical and subjected them to far less stringent testing. And the result was a boom in the pharmaceutical industry, creating tons and tons of vaccines. And I am not anti-vax. I think it's obviously sensible policy and good science and good medicine to vaccinate a large population against dangerous and deadly diseases. But at the same time, I think we as the public should expect rigorous testing of any product that's going to be injected into a newborn baby. And certainly we would expect, I think, real serious ramifications for any pharmaceutical company that releases something that's not fully tested or is shown to injure children.
I agree with you, Jason. If you're going to be a corporation and you're going to sell via the capitalistic system, then you have to be liable for anything you do wrong. And the best way to make sure that you don't do something wrong is to make sure that you can be compensated for an error by passing a law saying you can't go after them. What is the safeguards that we're going to have?
Right.
other than a promise. And I think that's wrong. I think what happened was there was disreputable research in vaccinations. I think the article may have even been published in Lancet showing some sort of link of autism with some material within vaccines
The
that are actually
DPT vaccine, I
right.
think, had thimerosal in it.
Right. And they found out that that journal article was totally made up and it was
Huh.
totally disreputable.
Huh.
And so there is no danger of autism due to these medications. It's just not going to happen, and you should get vaccinated.
Well,
But at the
but
same
rather
time,
than take us in that direction, because that's a whole other series of conversations, let's go back, because we only have a few minutes left. I want to talk about your case and what's going to happen in the future and how you resolve this matter and all that kind of stuff.
okay, so what we did is they dragged it out for 13 months, thinking that they would scare me, and I wasn't scared. And here's the tragedy. Here's the tragedy. First of all, the state's attorney couldn't try my case because there was a conflict of interest. The state's attorney represents the coroner, so the alleged dastardly act occurred while I was a coroner. Therefore, the state's attorney can't come after me or shouldn't come after me because it's a conflict of interest. He tosses it to the Illinois State Appellate Prosecutor's Office, which is interesting, controlled by the Democrats. So the first prosecutor I get is named Brian Town, and I love saying his name, Brian Town, who had lost his election in 2016 as LaSalle County State's Attorney and immediately slid into being a special prosecutor for the state of Illinois. Nice, smooth transition without any interview. He's indicted on 17 counts of felonies, while my prosecutor, basically, he founded a vigilante police force that extracted $400,000 of citizens of LaSalle County because maybe your mud flaps were half an inch too high. So they pulled you over and they smelled marijuana, and they found marijuana in your car, despite the fact you never used it. Well, he got to sell a lot of cars that way, build up $500,000 and spent it in his reelection. He gets he gets indicted. Okay, the next prosecutor comes aboard. Unfortunately and sadly for him, he comes up with cancer. Cancer is near death. They had to find somebody in retirement to take my case because they knew it was such a BS case that they had to pull somebody out of retirement to try it. And by the time we finally got a prosecutor who was going to stay around, we negotiated a plea bargain, and I knew what they wanted. They wanted me not to be able to run for a certain amount of time. I'm 72, so they figured, okay, if he doesn't, we'll say he can't run till he's 80. He'll be dead by then. So I agreed to sign off on a plea bargain of a misdemeanor to election code. Now, hear me carefully.
Yes.
I bargained to a misdemeanor to the election code. Therefore, not only was that not a felony, it's also not perjury. It's not lying because I pled to an election code violation, not a criminal code violation. So I am not a perjurer. And they wanted 7 years, and they got now quickly 2 other people they indicted for the same grievous crime. They had to make sure it looked like they weren't just coming after me. Well, they indicted 2 teachers who did the same thing. One ran for superintendent. Anyway, they got off with, make a long story short, they plea bargained just after me, and of course, they got a lesser penalty. They got a misdemeanor to election code like me, but they only have a 1 year probation. They only had to pay $750. I had to pay $13,000.
Huh. And also, Doctor, notice how the Chicago Tribune is kind enough to include the word perjury in their headline, even though that's not the charge.
No. Well, that of course that. Oh yes, that's very good. That's good. That is the current one. That's right. That's right. He didn't read my lawyer's press release. Okay, he didn't read it because it clearly states he pled to a misdemeanor to election code. Perjury is a criminal code. Okay, this is election code. And I know Jim Newton, but I think he basically, I don't know if he deliberately did it or what, but anyway, that's where we stand. And we got rid of it. There was no way they were going to not go to trial unless I promised not to run. And unfortunately, when you look at Dr. Bosworth's case in South Dakota, the jury doesn't listen to the interpretation of the law. You have to knowingly sign those sheets, knowing you're committing a crime. I did not know that, nor did Annette Bosworth. However, juries don't read the code. They say, well, you're a doctor, you're probably wealthy, and you're supposed to be smart. For being stupid, we're going to nail you. And that's basically what happened to her. Okay,
Wow.
and I knew they do. The best I could hope for in Lake County would be a hung jury. I could not win the case. There's no way. They would get one or two people on that jury that would be for the bad guys, so to speak. And the best I could hope for would be a hung trial, and they'd come after me again, and I'd have to shell out more money to my attorney as we approach an election cycle. So they would drag it out. So I figured, okay, let's cop a plea. Now, hopefully the bad guys aren't listening, but
I'm sure they are.
okay, well, if we have a new election coming up, and if we get a new governor, who knows? Maybe he'll pardon me in time for 2020.
I hope so, Doctor. It seems like there's a real serious problem with corruption, not just in Lake County, but in Clark County and in Congress and in our whole federal government. We are really seeing an unprecedented level of corruption being exposed within the Department of Justice and elsewhere. So I'm hopeful that this is all occurring at a time where we're turning the tide of good versus evil. There's just a stunning array of law enforcement individuals in your county there who are just actively involved in some pretty insane criminal activity.
Well, yeah, and the listeners should really get hold of the New York Times article, prosecutions cases against DNA, see what it's like in Lake County. It hasn't changed much. I will say this, I'm very proud of the 4 years. We had one town that used to kill citizens almost yearly. We stopped it when I came in. Because one of the cases that I did was a obvious police homicide against a citizen where they beat him to death. And the coroner Yancey, the guy who we talked about, would not label that a homicide. And homicide's a neutral term. It's one person killing another person. It's a neutral term. It doesn't say it's justified or not. He wouldn't even label it a homicide. He labeled it undetermined. He basically said, I don't know why the guy died. And when I came in, I flipped it to homicide, turned it over to the state's attorney. I said, what are you going to do? And Mr. Hare, I said, I'm not doing anything. And the family said, well, Dr. Rudd labeled it a homicide. He says, well, I don't give a blank what Dr. Rudd said. I'm not doing anything.
Wow. Dr. Rudd, you've been so valuable to us in revealing things about how important a coroner is, like what you've just described, where a corrupt coroner can fail to call something a homicide. That prevents certain types of police investigations and other investigations from proceeding. And certainly a corrupt coroner can be an extremely valuable asset to criminals. And that's something really dangerous. So I definitely think that raising people's awareness to that fact is important. And I want to thank you for all the work that you've done, not just there in Lake County, where you've sacrificed so much personally, financially, etc., but also for the help that you've provided to me and to the Crowdsource community in understanding some of these things and shedding light on them, because obviously light is the best disinfectant. And before we wrap it up for this evening, Doctor, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, a couple things that maybe next time will appear on the net. We can discuss the Glenowitz case. Yes. But let me just say that to let the citizens know, a coroner is equal to a sheriff. That means the coroner is the highest law enforcement official in the county with the sheriff. Only the coroner can arrest the sheriff if he's indicted. Because once the sheriff is indicted, the coroner runs the sheriff's office, and vice versa. If a coroner is indicted, if I was indicted when I was in office, then the sheriff would run it. So sheriff and coroner are equal, And that's why you must be very careful who you vote in as your coroner.
Yes, it's important, and obviously this is very relevant to what's going on in Las Vegas. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Thomas Rudd. Fantastic guest, always giving us great information. For our viewers on Periscope, I've just learned that we're only 13,000 hearts away from becoming a super broadcaster. I'm not even really sure what the value of that is, but hey, let's become a super broadcaster on Periscope. And I do want to remind everyone that if you value the interviews and the information that Crowdsource the Truth is bringing you, please make sure you go on to patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and consider becoming a monthly sponsor. Even $1 or $5 a month helps keep the company financially healthy, and we can bring you more interviews with experts like Dr. Rudd. Doctor, thank you so much for everything that you've done, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Very good, Jason.
Have a good evening, sir. Talk to you soon.
All right, bye-bye.
And thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow.